Hi, my name is Stephen Sharko, and today I'm going to present to you on the French Army mutinies of 1917. In order to understand why the French Army mutinies took place, I wanted to give some introductory context into the French Army and the lives of soldiers during the First World War. The order for the mobilization of the French Army was first given on the 1st of August, the same day that Germany had actually declared war on Russia, and immediately called to the regiments were the classes of 1896 to 1910, which comprised of almost 3 million reservists from about 24 to 38 years old. However, the war actually began in France with a series of catastrophic battles, such as the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of Somme. For soldiers, the war was defined by two types of very different experiences. A very, very difficult day-to-day life, in addition to series of very intense periods of combat. The type of day-to-day life that soldiers would experience would consist of very difficult conditions, hard labor, and very long walks, all of which would have to be endured in all types of seasons, which consisted of all different types of weather. In addition to these types of very difficult conditions soldiers would face, they would also have to deal with other annoying nuisances such as lice, rats, and vermin, in addition to having low morale, discouragement, and boredom, having to pass long periods of time just waiting in trenches. Another fact that soldiers would have to endure would be the very difficult fact of combat. And in reality, after occurring massive casualties and after the Battle of Somme and Verdun, the radicalization of this war's violence actually resulted in a change in the way that nature of combat was actually conducted during this war. Now, providing some background knowledge on the French Army mutinies, following what I had said in the introduction, by April 1917, over 1 million French troops had been killed. Even more had been wounded, and all this occurred in less than 3 years of war. Most had also fought and died in seemingly hopeless battles of attrition on the Western Front, and even if they had survived these big offensive battles, as I had previously mentioned, life in the trenches was truly grim. Therefore, mutinies had occurred throughout the French army from April 17th to June 30th, and in total there were about 250 different instances of mutinies. And by the end of the war, on November 11th, 1918, the French army had called up to 8.8 million men, including 900,000 colonial troops, and had suffered around 6 million casualties, including 1.4 million dead, 4.2 million wounded, and roughly 71% of those who had fought. Now that we've understood the context and figures surrounding the French army mutinies, let's get into the actual events that triggered these mutinies to begin occurring. So Marshal Joffre was effectively relieved of his duties on December 13th, 1916, following the heavy human losses at the Battle of Verdun and the Somme. He was replaced by Robert Nivelle, who began the war as a regimental colonel and was appointed commander-in-chief. In April 7, 1917, French General Nivelle promised a war-winning, decisive victory. He promised to work closely with the British Army to break through the German lines on the Western Front by a great attack against the German-occupied Chemin des Dames, a long and prominent ridge that runs east to west just north of the Aisne River. Nivelle applied a tactic that he had used with success at the first and second offensive battles of Verdun in October and December 1916, a creeping barrage in which French artillery fired its shells to land just in front of the advancing infantry to keep the Germans under cover until they had been overrun. Now keep in mind, the attacking infantry was to follow the barrage so closely that it was expected to suffer some casualties from friendly shells falling too short, just to give a perspective of the sort of battle tactics used by the French army during this time. Now, whether Nivelle's attack at the Second Battle of Aisne was a total failure is left up to some bit of controversy. The attack had achieved some of its objectives by exhausting the German reserves and conquering some strategic positions on top of the Chemin des Dames ridge, but it did so with exceptionally high French losses. Therefore, Nivelle was removed from his command on the 15th of May 1917 and was replaced by General Philippe Pétain. And by mid-April, it soon became clear that certain sections of the French army, primarily infantry regiments, had had enough. The start of the mutinies is considered to have occurred on April 17th, one day after the failed Nivelle offensive. 17 men from the 108th Infantry Regiment abandoned their posts in the face of the enemy. 12 were sentenced to death, but all were soon reprieved. As I had previously touched on in the last slide, the French army mutinies began to occur after the loss of the Second Battle of Aisne. The French army had basically had enough. Their morale was broken, and after yet another failed offensive, they were tired of being treated as pawns and did not want to engage in the sort of suicide warfare they were being forced into. So as a result, the French troops at Chemin des Dames suffered a steadily growing number of desertions since the end of April following the loss. On the 27th of May, those individual desertions turned into widespread mutiny. Up to 30,000 soldiers left the front line and reserved trenches and went to the rear. Even in regiments where there was direct confrontation, such as the 74th Infantry Regiment, the men did not harm their officers. They just refused to return to the trenches. Most mutineers were veterans who did not refuse to fight, but wanted the military authorities to be more attentive to the realities of the harshness of this modern warfare. So as we've touched on in previous slides, the mutinies occurred as a combination of horrible war conditions, weariness of soldiers, hopelessness of the prospect of the war, and furthermore, there were rumors of Russian Revolution, and things just in general were not looking good at all. The mutinies had occurred throughout the French army from April 17th to June 30th, and in total there are about 250 instances of reported mutiny. Faced with mutinies on a large scale, the French army, both officers and men, kind of struggled as to how they would react. I mean, there were only a few instances of soldiers simply refusing to face the enemy, though this did happen in early June with the infantry of the 60th Battalion and the 77th Infantry Division. In total, it was thought that only about 35,000 men were involved out of an army of 3.5 million. So only really about 1% they figured had actually mutinied. Though on paper it was a small number, a lot of the senior French commanders were actually worried for a number of valid reasons. Firstly, they were worried the situation in France would mimic the situation that was occurring in Russia. And another reason was the French Grand Courtier General was concerned that nearly all of the problems that had occurred in the units being held in reserve, the ones that were supposed to relieve the ones in the front, well, if the Germans had attacked and these men were unwilling to move to the front, what would end up happening? And the irony was, the Germans actually had no idea the mutinies that even were taking place. In fact, Ludendorff first knew about the crisis in the French army on June 30th, 1917, when it was practically nearly at an end. So, how did France ultimately respond to the mutinies that occurred within the army? Well, first off, as previously mentioned, luckily the French army did not have to deal with any repercussions of their German foes actually finding out about the mutinies and therefore taking advantage of them as a result. In fact, the French immediately put a cloak of secrecy over the whole affair, making it even difficult to find accurate figures for those who were punished after the war. Luckily, though, we do have those, which I will share with you shortly. First, though, however, we want to address the chronological sequence of events that occurred. So by June, almost all but a few of the mutinies had ceased. General Philippe Pétain, as the new commander of the French armies, who had replaced General Nivelle, was given the task of resolving grievances and dealing with those deemed major troublemakers. Pétain had wanted to instill discipline back in the army, but did not want a policy of total repression, as other senior officers had wanted. One example of that was General Duchesne, who had ordered that every 10th man in the battalions of the 32nd and 66th Infantry Regiments was to be shot as punishment for refusing to obey orders when these battalions were ordered to go back to the front line. 3 mutineers from these battalions were sentenced to death, but only one was actually executed. As I previously mentioned, the official figures given were actually that 3,247 soldiers were tried, 554 were sentenced to death, and 49 were actually executed. However, when it came down to the lives of soldiers following the war, Pétain had actually stayed true to his word when he dealt with addressing the grievances that were provided by the soldiers. Until he deemed that the time was right, he ordered that the French army should take no further part in offensives. He ordered that the leave was to be granted when time came for a soldier to be given it at the end of 4 months. Many commanders had actually been guilty of ignoring this during the war. Pétain was aware of the fact that many soldiers were as a result given extra duties to do at the rear when they should have been resting. So now he ordered that for those soldiers to take the appropriate time to rest, and he also did what he could to improve the quality of food that the soldiers were given, and that thousands of proper beds were ordered for the barracks to be built during these times. He also combined this with an effort to engender a feeling of patriotism with the army, and ultimately his approach worked. Unfortunately, however, the sacrifices of the French soldiers were to continue for yet another year, and by the time almost 1.5 million were dead and more than 4 million were wounded, these were losses that would profoundly shape France for the following decades. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I hope you have a great day.